All right, welcome everyone to today's Chai Chat organized by the Markaz. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Markaz, it's a resource center here at Stanford, and we offer programming for students who are interested in and or are identify with the Islamic community. We organize tons of programming each year, from afternoon chai social hours to chai chats like this one. And today we are joined by Dr. Abubakar Abid to talk about Muslims in the age of artificial intelligence. And Dr. Abid completed his PhD in electrical engineering here at Stanford. And his research interests include self-supervised learning, generative models, and applications of machine learning to biology and medicine. He is an author of the study published in Nature Machine Intelligence entitled Large Language Models Associate Muslims with Violence. And he was a recipient of the Stanford Data Science Seed Grant Award, the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship, and the Stanford Graduate Fellowship. Welcome, Dr. Abid.
Hey, hello everyone. Salam alaikum. I was telling Aisha before this that when I was a PhD student at Stanford, I attended a chai chat on Arabic calligraphy, and I thought it was great, a lot of fun. I learned a lot. So I'm very honored to be kind of on the other side of this and share. I mean, I just graduated a few months ago. It seemed really weird, but kind of just to share some research that we did that found very interesting associations between some of the kind of the latest, state-of-the-art machine learning work, especially natural language, and interestingly, bias as it relates to like associating Muslims with violence, things that you hear about a lot in terms of the media. But we found that a lot of this had trickled into machine learning work. And so I'm really excited to be able to share some of that with you today. How do we want to go ahead and do this? Actually, do we want to jump into questions, or should I give some background first?
Yeah, sure. I just want to let everyone know that the way this is going to work is that the first half of this session is going to be just me and Dr. Abid talking and me asking him questions about the topic. And then the second half will be where we open it up to audience Q&A. And so we'll give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions that you have. But yeah, we can just jump in. Tell us about your study.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so I looked at something called GPT-3. So for those of you guys who don't know about GPT-3, GPT-3 is a very, very powerful machine learning model, and it's called a language model. And what that means is it looks at statistical patterns in language, in written text, and uses that to kind of be like this super powerful autocomplete. So what I mean by that, so if you take out your iPhone or if you take out your phone and you start typing, you get these suggestions, right? You start typing, I went home and ate some, and it'll automatically suggest food. So models like that, they're called language models. And GPT-3 is an extremely powerful language model that has two kind of important characteristics that you should keep in mind. The first is that GPT-3, like if you look at your phone, like its suggestions are basically based on what you tend to type. So if you tend to use certain words a lot, it'll kind of tune its suggestions based off of what you're writing. But GPT-3, it's actually not trained on any one particular person's language. It's really trained on all of the written language on the internet. Whatever the authors of GPT-3 could scrape from the internet. That means news articles, that means social media, that means books. All of that was fed into this language model to try to be able to predict, what's kind of the next word in this sentence. And then the second thing that you should keep in mind about GPT-3 is that it's extremely powerful at learning context and using that to make useful completions. And so what I mean by that is on your phone, if you do autocomplete, okay, it might fill in the rest of your message, but you can actually use GPT-3 to write entire stories, write entire articles, and it'll write it in a very coherent manner. And you can also use it for things like, for example, summarizing text or answering questions. You give it some examples of questions, multiple choice questions, and the way you want it to be answered. And then it learns these patterns on the fly, and you can use it to answer brand new questions that you don't know the answer to. It just kind of learns statistical patterns in language to answer these questions. Now, what we found, and maybe what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share my screen a little bit. I'm not going to go too much into like the depth of a lot of like technical details or anything like that. But what I will show is just some examples of what we found. What we found, like the kind of the punchline here, is what we found is that if you start writing text about Muslims, it tends to complete that text in very violent ways. And so this is I'm going to be showing some examples of that. And this is like joint work that I'm presenting with with my colleagues and co-authors, Maheen Faruqi and Professor James O at Stanford. But let me show you an example here. So everyone should be able to see my screen now. Okay. So let's start with a very kind of neutral prompt. Okay, so I'm going to give it some prompt that looks like this. In a shocking finding, scientists discovered a herd of unicorns living in a remote, previously unexplored valley, so on and so on. If you give it some text like this, you'll find that GPT-3 is very good at like completing this. Like it'll write the rest of the article for you. Now, if you look at this, this looks very much like human written text. You know, they were found to have perfectly coiffed hair and what, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like it doesn't have to be true. Like there's no, you know, grounding, like it doesn't have to be like factually correct in any way, but it'll just like look at statistical patterns. Okay, what do articles that start like this usually continue to have? And so there you have it. You have an article, you have a blog post, whatever you might be interested in writing. Okay, now, like I was saying earlier, one of the cool things about GPT-3 is that you can use it to do other things as well. And so one of the things that the original authors of the study found is that you could give it analogies. So you could give it, now I think for most of us who took the SAT like maybe a long time ago, like myself, we've seen these analogies before, but if you haven't, they're pretty, you know, intuitive. Like you're given two words like audacious is to boldness as what is to what. And GPT-3 can learn to actually answer these questions correctly. And this is really cool because it's showing that it can actually learn to pick up complex associations between words. And it turns out that GPT-3 gets a performance of more than like 60% on this, whereas the average college student gets about 57%. So that's pretty cool. Now, what we were curious about is, okay, so if it's learned these, you know, complex associations, what else might have, you know, has it learned, especially about Muslims? Like what has it learned? And we actually tried GPT-3. So you can, you know, GPT-3 has this playground where you can put in some words and it'll complete it for you. And so I went ahead and actually tried it. And so I put in something like two Muslims. Okay, so let me go ahead and let me try to show this. Okay, so I just put in, one second, go back here. So I put in the starting prompt, two Muslims, very general, and I had it complete the rest of the sentence. And what you found was it said, two Muslims, one with an apparent bomb, tried to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma in the mid-1990s. Now, this is pretty crazy for multiple reasons. First of all I put in was two Muslims. It could have said anything about two Muslims, but it chose to have this like violent kind of thing. And this is not just like, this is interesting. It's also factually, you know, incorrect. It wasn't Muslims who tried to do this in the mid-1990s. But the point here is that it's completely unhinged with actual facts. It just tries to complete the sentence in a reasonable sounding way. And so I continued playing around with this. And so, you know, modified the prompt here. So now what I'm doing here is two Muslims walked into. Okay. So, you know, for example, you might complete this as like a joke. Two Muslims walked into something. But you can see the ways that GPT-3 tried to actually complete the sentence. And it's pretty shocking. Okay. It's pretty shocking. So I kept going. I tried to like make it a little bit more, you know, a little bit more neutral. Maybe two Muslims walking into a mosque. Maybe we'd talk about something about like worshiping or something. And then it just made like a little joke or something. But again, about terrorism, but about violence. And then finally, I tried to make it like extremely explicitly focused on like peaceful things. Two Muslims walked into a mosque to worship peacefully. And you can see how it completed. Now, this is obviously not good. Essentially, GPT-3 has learned this very unidimensional representation of Muslims, where really anytime it seems Muslims, it tries to associate that with violence. And we ended up probing this in a lot of different ways that I can talk about if you have more questions. But and what we found was, in general, that this bias is both extremely prevalent, so a lot more than what we expected, and it's also very persistent. There are things that we tried to remove this bias, but they weren't particularly effective at doing that. Yeah. So that's like a quick summary of our paper.
Oh yeah, that's very shocking. And kind of unsettling to imagine that this AI is doing things like that. Were almost all of the completed sentences when you began with something related to Muslims, did they all end in this, or were some of them peaceful? Or?
Yeah, so that is a good question. So we did quantify it. So if it turns out that if you put in Muslims, you get about 66%, about 2/3 of them were violent completions. And even many that were not violent were not exactly positive. So, and this is substantially higher than other religious groups as well. So of course we did, basic comparative studies. And yeah, and so it's generally, it's pretty prevalent.
So why exactly is this happening? Where is GPT-3 getting all this information?
Yeah, so GPT-3, it's very interesting. So basically, and this is, I think, a general problem with machine learning research, is that the machine learning models are extremely data hungry. So what that means is the more data that you give these models, the better they do. And so what researchers end up doing generally is they try to scrape as much information off the internet as possible. And so a lot of the stuff that's easiest to scrape are things like social media websites and forums and all of that, because that represents like human sounding text in a format that's very easy to scrape. Like there's tons of it. There's billions plus people using social media, and these different forums and stuff like that. And so a lot of it is just like what people have written on the internet. And, it might not be content that most of us encounter on a daily basis, but there's a lot of it out there. And like the other thing that's interesting is that there isn't a lot of other content about Muslims. Like when Muslim identity is mentioned on the internet, it's often in these like violent contexts because of news articles, because of like political commentary and things like that. And so because Muslims maybe are not writing other things about ourselves, this ends up becoming the dominant things that GPT learns about Muslims.
Okay, that makes sense. And so what does this mean in the application of GPT-3 in the real world? Like, if I type in a sentence using if GPT-3 was on my phone and I type in a sentence starting with Muslims, would all of those associations be violent? How is this going to like cause real world problems? Like, what does this mean?
Yeah. So that's a great point. So language models like GPT-3 are already being used in a lot of different applications, and I can talk about some of them. But so what the good news is that most of the applications of GPT-3 are not autonomous. So what I mean by that is most applications of GPT-3 is used as kind of like a suggestion engine. And then ultimately it's humans, who ultimately make that decision. And so let me give you a couple of examples. So one big application of GPT-3 is copies. So for those who may know this, so copying is when a company tries to write like advertisement and branding slogans and things about their product for a particular demographic. So for example, like a company like Coke may want to come up with a lot of like taglines and different things and ads and stuff that they can use. So this is called writing copies. And usually like basically humans come up with like 10 different copies, they send them to somebody else, they get feedback, and then they update it. So nowadays GPT-3 is actually being used by a number of companies, very successful companies actually, to write copies that are then proofed by humans. So definitely biases that GPT-3 has learned can infiltrate into these products, in these copies, but ultimately it's the human making that decision, so they're able to filter it out. Similarly, like GPT-3, one of its variants called Codex is actually powering code suggestion engine. So as programmers are writing code, it actually gives you suggestions on what to write. And I've actually played around with this, and you can actually see examples of Muslim bias, like Muslim violence bias, in the example suggestion sometimes. So if let's say you were to write something like, I want to write a program that can like categorize a religious, like the religion of this article or something like that, like what religion is talking about. And you might want certain keywords associating with different religions. If you ask Codex for some suggested keywords, it'll even suggest like violent keywords for Muslim, things like that. So, but ultimately in these applications, humans can come in and actually, correct for these biases. So that's the good news, is that many of the applications, I would say probably right now, most of the applications of GPT-3 are not autonomous, like a human is supervising it. That being said, definitely, there are people that are trying to build autonomous applications as well. So things like chatbots, things like summarization, question answering engines. So a lot of companies have a lot of internal documents. They want to summarize them really quickly, or they want to be able to ask questions about the documents. And so they're utilizing the power of GPT-3 to do that. And that could potentially be problematic, because what ends up happening is that, for example, if you ask it a question and it's about like some of their Muslim customers or something, it could answer in a violent way. We actually tested like what this might look like. And so I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. We can go back to this. So what we ended up doing was we ended up building a storytelling app. So this is kind of like Humans of New York style stories. We would give it a picture, and then we would use a machine learning model to generate a caption, which then GPT-3 would turn into a story about that picture. And so, for example, we put in this picture here, and it would come up with this like honey caption, which is kind of nice. It's funny, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a magician. I would spend hours studying the same trick. I would try to figure out how it was done so I could learn how to do it. But when I finally figured out how to do a trick, I would never do it again. I just didn't enjoy it anymore. I'm glad I figured that out before I spent a lot of money on all of the supplies I would need to become a professional magician. So that caption was actually written by GPT-3. It's pretty cool, actually. It's nice, it's funny, it's poignant. Now, if you give it a picture of a person wearing a hijab, it goes crazy. You can see an example here. Basically, it starts talking about defeating the infidels and this and blood and all this stuff. And so things like this, and this actually is very interesting, because another area where GPT-3 is being used in somewhat of an autonomous way is it's powering characters in video games. So writing dialogue for characters in video games, especially minor characters, that can be very time consuming. So a lot of companies are actually replacing them with language models, believe it or not, including GPT-3. So there's a whole GPT-3 dungeon. There's a lot of other things you guys can check out. But people have actually tried talking about Muslims, and it responds in these very violent ways. And so that's obviously a problem. And that's kind of, those are some examples of where GPT-3 could cause actual real harm in the real world.
Okay, so what can be done? You mentioned a little bit about how GPT-3 isn't autonomous. There are humans who are checking some of these things in some cases. Yeah. But what about in the development level, when tech developers are developing these kinds of models, especially for students here at Stanford, who many of whom do want to go into the tech industry, do want to go into machine learning, like what can they do to avoid these kinds of biases in these models?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a really good question. I think that I think one very important thing is when you're developing technology to look at the broader context of how it's going to be applied, right? So oftentimes when we are building algorithms or when we're building models, it's very easy just to focus on maximizing a particular metric on a tightly controlled data set. Right? Like we want to get really good accuracy here, and we forget exactly the broader context of how this might actually be deployed. And when we start thinking about the broader context, that actually opens up, I think, a lot of opportunities to do nice, like important, impactful research. And so one example is nowadays, there's now, because of issues like what we raised and other people raised about racial bias and things like that, there is a tremendous amount of emphasis now being focused on developing better data sets to train these models. Like doing a better job in the early stage of like filtering out, very extreme content, very, very strong content, and just like building a kind of a better, richer, more socially desirable data set. And so there's a lot of work there. That's promising. Another kind of thing that we can think about is, again, like looking at the broad application of how GPT-3 and other language models are used. We can think about, okay, so in what use cases is it really important to develop these ethical checks? Like one of the things that OpenAI, the company that developed GPT-3, did was they ended up putting checks afterwards, like if any completion, anything had violent keywords, then they would flag it. So thinking about what are the ethical standards that we want the algorithms to produce, kind of similarly how we think about for ourselves, what are the ethical standards for our work, for our output, for our for our work, we kind of want to do something similar for the work that's produced by these algorithms.
All right. In the last few minutes before we switch to audience Q&A, I want to switch gears a little bit because there's a side to the conversation in terms of Muslims and artificial intelligence. I mean, we've been talking so far about how AI affects Muslim populations, but there's also the side of Muslims who are interested in going into these AI-related fields.
Yeah.
And I know there's been some discussion in Islamic scholarly circles about the extent to which the development of AI itself is Islamically ethical. And I was kind of curious about your take on this, since you study machine learning, you've looked at AI models. There's this idea that developing artificial intelligence is kind of analogous to playing God. Do you agree with that? I mean, there are things like AI in self-driving cars where AI, artificial intelligence systems could decide if they're like driving towards an intersection and there's a pedestrian, whether to swerve or whether to hit the pedestrian, that kind of thing. So yeah, what's your take on this?
That's really interesting. So that's a good question. So in some sense, like these AI, these algorithms are in some sense trying to play human, right? So they're trying to make the decisions that normally humans would take. So in some sense, this is not something that's dramatically that different. In the sense that, for example, we've always trusted tools, like we've always developed tools and technology to do things that previously humans were doing. And in the design of those technologies and those tools, whether that might be, farming equipment, or whether that might be, computers doing calculations on spreadsheets and so on. That's always been the case. Like we've always delegated more and more work to humans. And so to technology. And so from that perspective, I don't think there's, I'm by no means an Islamic scholar, but that doesn't seem like there's an ethical problem underlying that. Now, what's interesting is that we're increasing now the extent to what decisions are being performed algorithmically. So now, you're right. Now autonomous car might have to decide whether to hit two adults, there's two paths, either you turn left and you hit two adults, or turn right and hit a child or something like that. There are these complex, moral questions that we now have to codify in some sense. So I think, so the interesting thing is that oftentimes, I think this is a very interesting development, because previously there were ethical questions that no one really asked, because it just seemed like nobody would really need to answer those questions, right? So like if someone was in an accident where they had to make these types of decisions, no one would blame them if they made a spur of the moment decision that ended up being, bad, because like human reasoning, in the spur of the moment, we're not really responsible necessarily for all of our actions. But now, in some sense, we have to build these algorithms and we have to make these decisions ahead of time. And so I think it opens up a lot of very important moral questions that we have to think through. And, Islamically, we have this ethical framework where we can think through this and propose solutions for how, for how these machines should behave in different situations. But I don't think it's so much playing God. It's like it's reflecting on what would a just and rational human do in these situations. What are we advised to do based on our moral teachings, and then transferring and codifying that knowledge into technology.
Thank you for that. Now we're going to conclude the portion where I ask you questions, and we can open it up to the audience. Does anyone have questions for Dr. Abid related to anything he's talked about today?